Hello, welcome to this revision video for Elizabethan England, the Edexcel history course. So this is going to set out some example questions that could be asked in the exam. You'll need to do a lot of extra revision, but this will just give you an introduction and some of the key themes and some ideas for some of these essay questions. All right. So first of all, you can see the spec starts in the first section is 1558 to 69. Here are some topics things they could ask you. So describe one feature of Elizabethan society. This you could be talking about the hierarchy they had, the differences between towns and rural areas. Talk about the monarch being at the top. You could talk about how religion was very important. You could talk about how in towns you had more people like merchants. You could talk about the nobility, the gentry. You could say that it was a very patriarchal society, etc. This should be in all of the revision guides to make sure you've kind of revised an answer for that. Also, they could ask you about government. This could be about Privy Council, the court, Parliament, Justice of the Peace, Lord Lieutenants, etc. Okay, next question could be a 12 marker. They could ask you, for example, about Elizabeth's challenges that she faced when she became queen on her accession in 1558. Be careful with the date. You can't kind of start talking about the Spanish Armada. We're looking specifically at 1558. So you could talk about the fact that some people thought she was illegitimate. People thought she was weak because she was female. Also, there's the issue of marriage, because she's a female monarch. If she married an Englishman, he would technically be beneath her. But if she married a foreign king, prince, England could lose power, as that, that person could be, as a male, could be more dominant. England was also in debt of £300,000. England had problems of poverty. There are religious divisions in England between Protestants and Catholics, and some Catholics wanted a Catholic queen like Mary, Queen of Scots. England was also at war with France. This was a war that Elizabeth's older sister Mary had started, and the war was going badly. And one of the first things Elizabeth will have to do is give up in this war, and she'll have to lose Calais in northern France. There was also this potential threat of invasion from France, especially through Scotland. Okay, they could ask you as a 60 marker, which of these was the biggest challenge? For example, this one could say, was it about debt? I would say that debt was probably one of her biggest problems, because it meant that she could not build up her army to deal with the potential threats from Catholics at home and from other countries. But obviously there are a range of, you could argue something different. Another question could be asking you to consider whether or not she was in a strong or weak position when she became queen. In terms of all the weaknesses, well, we know we've just looked at a bunch of those weaknesses. Strengths, though, she was intelligent, resilient due to her upbringing. She at one point had been living in the Tower of London, placed in prison essentially by her sister, Mary I, and she thought she was going to die at any point. She had royal blood. She had powerful Protestant supporters in the south of England. What I would say, though, is I agree with the statement. She was in a weak position. However, she was lucky that she had a strong character, as it meant she could deal with many of these issues, but she was not in a strong, lucky position when she became queen. She had more problems than strengths. Next thing, they could ask you to describe the feature of the religious settlement. Remember, the religious settlement is when Elizabeth is going to make changes to religion in England. She's going to have mainly Protestant features, but she will allow some Catholic features in there to keep Catholics happy. So, for example, vestments and crucifixes will be allowed. And the religious settlement had two main parts. The Act of Supremacy is essentially going to be ensuring that Elizabeth will now be the head of the church, and it will no longer be the Pope. And all people in England had to follow these rules. They could ask you about a feature of the Church of England in England. You could say, well, it helped Elizabeth with the religious settlement. It preached the government's message. Essentially, what the church is doing is it's saying that people should be loyal to Elizabeth. And it also charged a 10% tax on people called the tithe. So next thing we would go to, that says 1559. And that's the religious settlement. And the question is, why was it challenged? Well, we could talk about challenges from the Puritans, who believed that it was too Catholic, the religious settlement, because it allowed crucifixes and vestments. You could say it was challenged by the Catholic nobility. Many were recusants who refused to go to Church of England services. And it was also challenged by Catholic nobles like Westmoreland and Northumberland, who used the mainly Protestant religious settlement to gain support from Catholics in the north of England with the revolt of the Northerners in 1569. It was also challenged by the papacy in the Vatican City in Rome, who did not like the Protestant features such as the Act of Supremacy that stated that Elizabeth, not the Pope, would be the head of the Church of England. The Pope ordered Catholics in England not to attend Church of England's services, And Spain and France also disliked the settlement as they were both Catholic countries, and Spain supported the revolt of Northern Wales in 1569, and the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570. So they could ask you what the biggest challenge to the religious settlement was, and they could ask you if it was the Puritan challenge. I would say that the Puritan challenge was the smallest threat, as this group were Protestant, mainly like Elizabeth. She easily dealt with this challenge by banning crucifixes and by simply sacking 37 Puritan priests. The papacy and the foreign powers had the potential to be very dangerous, but they did nothing really directly to challenge the religious settlement. The biggest challenge actually would have come from Catholic nobles in England, and the revolt of the Northern Wales is a good example of that. They are an internal threat, so obviously it's going to be more of an issue for Elizabeth. So the next thing you could be asked is if the religious settlement actually made the religious divisions between Protestants and Catholics worse. Basically being asked here, was it a successful policy? You could say it led to Catholic plots such as the Revolt of the Northern Wales, Rodolphi, Throckmorton and Babington, but these plots were all unsuccessful, and the majority of Catholics in England accept the religious settlement, as Elizabeth did include some Catholic features. You could say that she had a clever policy of allowing Catholics not to follow some parts of the religious settlement, and she kind of turned a blind eye to it. She wasn't really strict and harsh on those Catholics who didn't follow it at first. And generally speaking, it kept the Catholics happy. And it was certainly really successful for the first 11 years. But from 1569, with the start of the plots, it's not as successful, you could argue. Next thing, Mary, Queen of Scots. They could ask you to describe her claim to the throne. You could say she's the second cousin of Elizabeth. She had royal blood. She was related to Henry VII. She was Catholic, and she was supported by many Catholics. There was no legitimacy issue. In terms of her parents' marriage, it was all pretty straightforward. No controversy there. No dodgy divorces or anything like that. Okay, you could talk about the relationship between them. Well, at first, Mary, Queen of Scots flees to England because Scottish Protestant lords are after her. She was accused of being part of the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley. So in terms of the relationship, Elizabeth sees her as a threat, but she does not want to execute her. But she also does not want her to be free in England because she sees her as a threat. So what she does is she keeps her under house arrest. And also she's still her cousin's family. They don't ever meet, but she still sees her as family, and she's an anointed monarch chosen by God. So Elizabeth is really reluctant. She doesn't want to execute her. Okay, the next part of the course, we're looking at 1569 onwards. And now we're getting more challenges to Elizabeth at home and abroad. Okay, so they could ask you one feature of the revolt of the Northern Wales. You could say that they marched on Durham, they took control of the cathedral, continued south, but support from Spain did not arrive. And the majority of landowners stayed loyal to Elizabeth. Next question they could ask was why this was launched in the first place. You would say it's a combination of power. These northern earls had lost power. They were annoyed that Elizabeth was favouring other people such as William Cecil and Robert Dudley. So they're annoyed about that. They're also annoyed that they've lost money. For example, Northumberland had lost rights to his copper mine, and so he was losing money as a result. And the other reason is just religious. They were Catholic, mainly in the north, and they're unhappy about the Protestant dominance in the religious settlement. So this could lead you to a 16 marker. Was it all about the religious settlement? I would argue that it wasn't really about religion for Northumberland and Westmoreland. For them, it was more about power and money. But maybe for the ordinary people who joined it, it was more about religion. So why was the revolt of the Northern Earls significant? It showed that Mary, Queen of Scots could not be trusted. She's going to stay under house arrest. It was the most significant plot of Elizabeth's reign. It led to Elizabeth's excommunication by the Pope. It was the first serious Catholic rebellion. It led to harsher laws against treason, especially for Catholics, and it ends the threat and influence of the Percy and Neville families. That's Westmoreland and Northumberland. And you could say now it does mean that Elizabeth now really has to be careful about English Catholics. Okay, Rodolphi plot. You could say it's 1571, Italian banker. Plan is for Mary to marry the Duke of Norfolk. This time there's help from Spain. Philip is involved again. Sir William Cecil uncovered the plot and the Duke of Norfolk is executed. Throckmorton plot is 1583. Spanish help again. The Pope approves. Walsingham discovered the plot. Throckmorton is executed. And we also get harsher treatment of on Catholics as a result. 11,000 put in prison after this. Next one, final plot, Babington plot, 1586. This time it's mainly French, but it's also going to be supported by Philip II and the Pope again. Walsingham intercepted letters, and this time there's direct evidence that Mary was involved, that Mary was actually supporting the plot. And as a result of this, we get more persecution of Catholics, and it's really, really significant because it leads to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Okay, so you could be asked an explain why question on why they were significant. You could just write a paragraph on each. Next thing, they could ask you to have a judgment on which of these was the most significant plot. I would say Throckmorton was not the most significant, as it did involve France, Spain, and the Pope, but it was pretty half-hearted. The most significant for me was the Babington plot. It leads to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and therefore ends this threat to Elizabeth. Babington plot for me is the most significant. I'll say it once again, because it leads to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. They could ask about how Walsingham has uncovered the plots, talk about his spy network. He had them all over Europe, going into North Africa, going towards the Middle East. He used secret codes, etc. All of that, all of the other stuff is written there. Why Mary, Queen of Scots was executed? Well, you could say because there was this, she was publicly saying that she should be Queen of England. You could say because she's linked to the plots. And you could also say because from 1585, there was this real threat before the Spanish Armada that Spain could invade England, and Elizabeth simply could not tolerate having this rival person alive. And a key other thing is that there is just this evidence with the Babington plot that she is involved. All of the other things are on the board or on the screen. Okay, so the question could be, a 60 marker could be, did she get executed because of England's relationship with Spain? I would say no. The main reason was that actually there's this evidence after the Babington plot. Before she was reluctant to execute her, but now she knows that Mary has actually plotted against her with the Babington plot. They found the letters, they've uncovered the letters with their spies with Walsingham. Now that's treason. She can't let this go. And so the main reason is because of her involvement in the Babington plot, in my opinion. Why was this significant? Well, because she was a cousin of Elizabeth. She was an anointed monarch. It ended the plots, but it really angered Spain even more. It makes Philip even more adamant that they need to invade England, even though they had already made the decision before this that they wanted to invade England. It just confirms that. And you could say it makes this relationship with Spain even worse. Okay, so the next thing, why is there this tension between England and Spain? Well, you could say because Spain has interfered in England with all four plots: Northernels, Ridolfi, Throckmorton, and Babington. They've got the religious difference. Spain is Catholic, England Protestant. Elizabeth had supported the Dutch rebels. They'd also stolen not diamonds, silver and gold in the New World with Drake, but also the English had stolen from the Spanish with the Genoese loan. We could talk about those religious differences, which I think we've just talked about. And also England had been provoking Spain in the New World. So you can read that stuff on the screen in your own time, but there's a bunch of reasons there. They could ask you what the main reason for the tension was. And I would say the main reason is Drake and England's stealing, privateering. The amount of money the English steal is huge. And I would argue that England is to blame. They are really provoking Spain by doing this, and they're really damaging the Spanish economy. And so obviously Spain needed to stop this happening. So I would say the stealing, the theft is the main reason. Okay, the next thing is looking at 1585 to 1888 and looking at the relationship between England and Spain. The reason they've chosen those dates is from 1585, they're technically at war. Spain and France signed the Treaty of Joinville in 1585, which means that they're essentially saying that they are going to try and stop Protestantism and protect Catholicism. And that is a direct attack. That's a direct statement about England. And then also it's from 1585 that England actually sends in their soldiers to help the Dutch rebels in the Netherlands. Robert Dudley is going to lead the English army. And then also in 1587, we get the English attack on Cadiz Harbour. And then in 1588, obviously, we get the Spanish Armada. Okay, two features of the attack on Cadiz. You could say it was called the singeing of the King of Spain's beard. 30 ships were damaged. Resources were also damaged from the Spanish side, and it was in 1587. One feature of the Spanish Armada plan, the plan was they had to go to the Netherlands first to pick up Spanish soldiers who were based in the Netherlands. Then they were going to sail to England, march to London, get rid of Elizabeth, make England Catholic. They also wanted to get revenge on England for what the English had been doing in the Netherlands, to stop English attacks in the New World, etc., and to get revenge for Mary Queen of Scots' execution, 1587. Okay, one of the key features of the events, you could talk about the fact that the English sent in the fire ships. We could talk about the fact that the Spanish lost at Gravelines and then were forced to travel north around Scotland and England. And you could actually make the point that most Spanish ships were actually destroyed by the storms and the weather, as opposed to actually being taken, destroyed by the English. So why do the Spanish get defeated? Why do the English win? You could talk about the poor communication between the Duke of Parma and the Duke of Medina Sidonia. Talk about the fact that the English had better, faster and more agile ships. The English used clever tactics with the fire ships that forced the Spanish to lose their special formation. The English had ships that could load and fire cannons more quickly. The Spanish were unlucky and were caught in storms, which meant they could not attack the English again. And the Spanish lacked enough food and resources. The question here is about the reasons for this victory, what the most important factor would be. I would say that the English did use some clever tactics. Great. However, the main reason the English were actually able to win this was because of the weather. The English had a partial small victory at Gravelines, but the Spanish, actually, most of their ships were not destroyed by the English, were destroyed actually by the weather. And I think had the English been luckier, had been more unlucky, and had been more unlucky, and the weather hadn't have helped them, actually, the Spanish could have tried to attack again, and England might have been in a more difficult position then, and the Armada could have won. Okay, final topic, which goes from 1558 to 1588. Okay, they could ask you about education in England. You could talk about the different type of education for noble boys, for middle-class boys, but also for girls. Obviously, one of the key points you can make is girls had a different education. Their type of education was more focused on domestic things. There's some more stuff on the screen, but you can also do some revision on that. They could ask you if education does change or stay the same in this period. One of the things you could say is that education does change. There are improvements for boys and the literacy rates do go up for boys. They're allowing more poorer boys to go to school. For example, with their grammar schools, some of them would have been funded by kind of wealthy donors in a charitable sense. But you could also say that actually education has not changed that much. Very few poor people in this period get any education at all. Literacy rates did not change for girls. And I would say in conclusion, there were only real partial changes. For the majority of population, there were no changes, as most poor and most girls saw no change. And they're the majority of people in England at the time. Okay, they could ask you about whether or not there were significant differences in the education of the rich and poor. How far would you agree? Well, I would agree to a large extent. Only some poor people could go to grammar schools, but they had to be exceptionally intelligent. And this was really not common at all. For the majority of poor people, they got no formal education. Only middle class and nobles received proper education. Okay, so the next thing could be describe one feature of sport in Elizabethan England. You could talk about the differences with the nobility and the lower classes. Some of the things you could talk about: hunting, hawking, fishing, fencing, real tennis, wrestling, swimming. And a lot of that, you could say that gambling and betting was involved as well, football as well being a sport for the lower classes. Pastimes. So sport could also be included in this, but you could also talk about spectator sports, like literally just watching others do the sport, animal fights, sports, literature for the educated, like Canterbury's Tales, but also music, dancing, and I haven't also included theatre here. Theatre is another thing they could ask you about. So you could say they no longer had religious mystery plays. It was more secular, not religious. Some of it was pretty rude and vulgar. Elizabeth had her own theatre company. They built theatres like the Rose. Only men would act in plays. And in the theatres, they would have more expensive seated tickets, but also there were cheaper standing tickets in the pit, so poorer people could go to the theatre as well. In terms of a 16 marker, they could ask you to compare similarity and difference between rich and the poor and whether or not they actually had similar leisure activities. I would say they did have pretty similar leisure activities. They both like sports, dancing, theatre, music, gambling, spectator sports, animal fights. And so actually you'd say lots of the things they enjoyed were similar. There were some differences, such as different seats in a theatre. Some sports were not done together. Dancing was separate. And obviously like football, for example, was known to be the lower classes. But despite that, there are lots of similarities. Considering how hierarchical English society was and how divided it was, actually, in some respects, this is quite similar. Next thing, they could ask you about poverty in Elizabethan England. So you could talk about how population growth has put pressure on jobs, land, and food. Food prices have gone up, wages have gone down. Land enclosure is linked to this. You could talk about problems with vagabondage, people begging, homelessness, etc., and poor harvests as well. So they could ask you why there is this increase in poverty and vagabondage. One thing you could say is reason one, population growth. This has put pressure on land, food, and jobs. You could also say that wealthy landowners have enclosed their land, this land which was previously common land, which everyone could use. And a lot of people relied on this land for stuff like food resources and like firewood. They can no longer use this land, so that's going to push them further into poverty. And then the other thing is there's more landowners sheep farming, and sheep farming employed fewer people, so which leads to more unemployment. And also you could factor in these poor harvests in the 1550s and 1560s. They could ask what the most important factor was and whether or not it was the increasing population. I'd say no. Just because there was a rising population doesn't necessarily mean that that had to lead to loads of poverty. If members of the government and landowners had used the land and resources more efficiently, they could have solved some of these problems. They made the problems associated with the rising population so much worse by enclosing the land and converting to sheep farming. At a time when the poorest in England needed the most, the wealthy landowners made changes that hurt the poor even more. I think that's a nice solid argument you could use. Okay, then we could ask why there were these changing attitudes to the poor. Well, or why there just were changing attitudes. You could say, first of all, because there's a rise in poverty linked to population growth, land enclosure, and sheep farming. There were more poor people. The second reason was that the government was worried about rising poverty could lead to disorder and rebellion. So they realized they had to solve this. They did this harshly by introducing laws against vagabondage, and repeat offenders could be punished with corporal punishment. So reason two could be about kind of the attitudes of landowners and the government. And then the third reason could be that actually there were some changes because people started to realize that not all poverty was just because people were lazy and bad people. They realized that poor people actually needed to be helped and it wasn't completely their fault. So actually you could say this change, there's a change in attitude, and they start actually helping some people, making a distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor. And they're trying to help more the deserving poor, people who were old, maybe disabled, or people who are sick. It wasn't their fault, they couldn't find work. Okay, and they could ask you actually whether or not attitudes in this period to poor people have changed or not. You could say that there was more government intervention to help the deserving poor and less harsh punishment. For example, people were given resources such as wool to make things to sell. Those who failed to pay poor relief, people who were refusing to pay money to help poor people, were themselves punished. But you could actually say in some respects there's not been much change. There's still punishments for vagabondage, still very harsh. The undeserving poor were still treated harshly by the government, and poor people were still seen as a threat by landowners and those in authority. There was some more lenient treatment and more compassion for the deserving poor, but overall attitudes to the poor did not really change. Well, they only changed to a partial extent. They did help some poorer people, but there's still this pretty harsh treatment. Okay, now we're looking at exploration. Why is there more exploration? Well, the first thing is they have just better technology on ships. With new sailing technology, there is just more trade available as well. There's more money to be made from trade. So the new technology you could talk about was they had new shipyards to build ships. There was the development of faster and more stable ships. They also have navigation aids such as astrolabes and quadrants, which mean that basically on their long journeys across the sea, they're not going to get lost so much. They're using like the stars to help them locate themselves. Okay, and the question could be like, what's the big factor? What's the most important factor driving this? I would say trade and profit is going to be the main thing. Yes, there is a love of exploration, but I think there's so much money to be made from trade and exploration that would have been the driving factor behind this. These journeys were still very risky, and I would argue that people only really did this because they realized that there was a lot of money to be made. So, linked to Drake now, he circumnavigates the world from 1577 until 80. Why does he do this? Well, he sails around the world because it's never been done before. Well, it's only been done by one crew before. So he wants to do it for kind of this like pride and this wish to be famous. He wants to be the second crew to be able to do this. You could also say he's motivated by greed and the prospect of stealing gold and silver from the Spanish. And you could say he's also doing this from a patriotic duty to help England, to try and help England's reputation, make trade links, and also claim land for England. So he's doing it for himself, but also, for his country. Does he do it for financial gain? I would say that is the most important factor. He actually says he doesn't intend to set out to circumnavigate the world. He's actually going out to attack the Spanish, but also he's a privateer first and foremost. He wanted to attack the Spanish, and he gets about 500 million pounds worth of money in today's money by doing this. So that's a key reason. Why was it significant? Well, when he does this, he helps to attack the Spanish, which is really helpful for England, especially later on in winning the Spanish against the Spanish Armada. They're stealing a lot from the Spanish, which also helps England to build up its own military with this money. And also, kind of, you could say at this time, not fully linked, this is the raid on Cadiz as well. He also inspires loads of English future explorers to do this. And we know England later on will develop this huge empire of its own. Okay, so question could be, was this his most significant achievement? I would say that the financial gains from this period of circumnavigation were so important. It allows England to build their navy up. It also allows them to build up their navy, military defenses, which is going to be huge for England with their victory in the Armada. You could also say that they wouldn't have been so successful at Cadiz if they hadn't had this money to build their own ships to defeat them at Cadiz. Okay, so why did the English attempt colonization of Virginia? Well, you could say Virginia would be important because there was natural resources there, stuff like tobacco. It would be a good location to be able to attack the Spanish in the New World, and also they could trade with Native Americans there. So those would be your three reasons. And the reasons why they're doing it, they could ask you, was this all about commercial rivalry with Spain? And I would say that's a key reason. The English realized that the Spanish had made so much money from what they were doing in the New World. The English wanted to copy this. That's one of the key reasons why they're inspired to go into Virginia and to basically be able to attack the Spanish, but also be able to try and replicate some of the things that the Spanish have been able to do in terms of making so much money. Okay, Raleigh. Raleigh is one of the key figures in Britain, or sorry, I should say England, setting up colonies in Virginia. So why is he significant? Well, he's the person charged to do this by Elizabeth. Elizabeth gives him permission to do this. He's the one that has to convince investors to give them money to pay for all of this. He plans the initial fact-finding mission to England, and he's the one who's recruiting settlers, but also people to go to Virginia. You could say his plan failed, but his blueprint, the stuff that he used was used later by successful English colonists. And he's the one that attempts England's colonies in settlement on Roanoke Island. Okay, so why does it fail? Well, it fails because they left late on the expedition. So they missed the growing season by the time they got to North America, which meant they couldn't grow any food and they had to ask the Native Americans. They're basically too reliant on the Native Americans. On the way, there was a ship damage on one of the ships called the Tiger. Gunpowder and seeds were damaged on the journey, which is obviously going to be a nightmare for protecting themselves, but also for growing food. Raleigh, when he'd been encouraging people to go, the settlers, he basically only focused on the really positive things. And the settlers, when they went, were expecting to be able to do no work and just essentially live a very nice life out there. So they were really disappointed and they weren't prepared to do any of the hard work, farming, building stuff, etc. when they got there. And they just failed to work together. He chose poor leaders such as Ralph Lane, and the Native Americans also grew sick of helping the English and turned hostile. So you'd say that it goes down to inadequate planning, inadequate food supplies, and also because of the Spanish Armada, they failed to supply the second settlement, and that's also going to be problematic. So they could ask you, was it all to do with Raleigh's poor planning? And I would say that, look, he was not careless. He did really try to make it work. He was organized. He did organize the fact-finding mission. He brought back Matteo and Marchesi to learn the local Algonquian language. He did really try to think about selecting different people, such as blacksmiths, farmers. He managed to persuade the settlers and the investors. But, so look, he clearly thought about it. However, many of the issues that did come up could have been predicted. And so it must go down to poor planning. For example, leaving late, they should have realized that that would lead to other problems. They were too reliant on the seeds. They didn't protect their seeds enough on the ship. They must have known that maybe there could be some issues on the journey, and they didn't protect the seeds enough. And they must have realized that the Native Americans wouldn't be just always helping them. So I think the biggest mistake he makes, though, I would argue, is actually just not communicating with the settlers how tough things would be, which meant that they were then really surprised. And I would say, had they not been so surprised, had they been more prepared to work hard, they maybe actually could have made it work. And I would say that in order to convince them, you could argue that he just lied to them. Okay, some other questions they could ask you. The biggest challenges for England between 69 and 86. So you could talk about the Spanish threat would be key. You could talk about some of the internal threats with the plots. You could talk about Mary Queen of Scots. You could talk about the reasons for the Catholic challenge. Well, that Catholic challenge here could be internally in the English nobles, but this could also be looking at the papacy, like the Pope and his key followers. It could also be looking at Spain and France as well. There are a range of things that we could talk about for that. I won't read these out, but you can see there's also a bunch of past paper questions on these two slides. Now, look, they could ask something else, but I would say looking at the specification, looking at past paper questions, if you have a basic argument for all of these questions, you should be in a pretty strong position for this. Now, obviously, I've told you about kind of the general ideas. Now you've got to go away and make sure that you've got good killer facts, names, places, dates, facts, and figures for all of these things that I've talked about. All right, good luck with your exam and take care.